Hey, what's up guys? John here. We are going to witness the biggest court case in American history. It's going to define how homes and apartments get power and electricity. It's going to define gas vehicles. It's going to change the financial sector, and it's even going to go as far as limiting and controlling the Fed's ability to increase interest rates. The Biden administration is moving forward with this case, and the fate of this country, the outcome of this country, is going to be largely determined by the outcome of this case. Now, in this video, I'm going to read this case to you, show you what they are trying to do, and then at the end, I'm going to give my opinion as to what I think about all this. If you could, just simply tap that like button. You hit the like button, YouTube's going to share the content with more people that simply just aren't aware of what's really going on, which is, in these days, almost 99% of people. So please just tap that like button. Let's begin. Hang in there on this article because it is very, very important. It's probably one of the most important things that we're going to witness in our lifetime is going to be this. Supreme Court could hear biggest climate change case in a decade. The court could handcuff President Biden's climate change agenda and restrict federal agencies from enacting new regulation governing health, workplace safety, and more. In the most important environmental case in more than a decade, the Supreme Court on Monday will hear arguments in a dispute that could restrict or even eliminate the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to control pollution that is heating the planet. A decision by High Court within its conservative supermajority could shred President Biden's plans to halve the nation's greenhouse emissions by the end of the decade, which scientists said are necessary to avert the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. They could handcuff the federal government's ability to affordably reduce greenhouse gases from power plants. The power sector is the second largest source in the United States of carbon emissions that are driving climate change, but the outcome could also have repercussions that stretch well beyond air pollution, restricting the ability of federal agencies to regulate healthcare, workplace safety, telecommunications, the financial sector, and more. If the court were to require the EPA to have very specific, narrow directions to address greenhouse gases, as a practical matter, it could be devastating to other agencies' ability to enact rules that safeguard the public health and welfare of the nation. It would restrict the enactment of regulation under the host of federal statutes, OSHA, the Clean Water Act, hazardous waste regulation. In theory, it could even limit the Fed's authority to set interest rates. At issue is a federal regulation that broadly governs emissions from power plants, but in a curious twist, the regulation actually never took effect and does not currently exist. The legal wrangling began in 2015 when President Barack Obama announced the Clean Power Plan, his chief strategy to fight climate change. Citing its authority under the Clean Air Act, the Obama administration planned to require each state to lower carbon dioxide emissions from the electricity sector, primarily by replacing coal-fired power plants with wind, solar, and other clean energy sources. Electricity generation is the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States behind transportation. But the Clean Power Plan was never implemented. After a barrage of lawsuits from Republican states and the coal industry, the Supreme Court put the project on hold. Once President Donald J. Trump took office, he instituted a new plan that was effectively the same as no regulation. But on the last day of Mr. Trump's presidency, the Federal Appeals Court found that Trump's administration has misconceived the law and vacated Trump's plan. That cleared the way for the Biden administration to issue its own regulation, which it has yet to do so. It is highly unusual for the Supreme Court to take up a case that revolves around hypothetical future regulation, legal experts said, trying to figure out the contours of the EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases. When there's no regulation being defended, it is just kind of a weird thing for the court to consider, said Jonathan Adler, a law professor at Case Western Reserve University. I was surprised when they took the case. The plaintiff in the case, West Virginia versus Environmental Protection Agency, want the High Court to block the kind of sweeping changes to the electricity sector that defined Obama's Clean Power Plan. Instead, Republican attorney generals in 18 states and some of the nation's largest coal companies will argue that the 1970s Clean Air Act limits the EPA to dictate changes only at individual power plants, not across the entire power sector. Conservatives have long argued that the executive branch routinely oversteps the authority granted by the Constitution in regulating all kinds of economic activity. This is really about fundamental questions of who decides the major issues of the day, said Patrick Morrisey, Attorney General of West Virginia, speaking at an event in Washington earlier this month ahead of his appearance before the Supreme Court on Monday. Should it be unelected bureaucrats or should it be the people, the representatives in Congress? That is what the case is all about. It's very straightforward. Others maintain that Congress delegated authority to the executive branch to broadly regulate air pollution under the Clean Air Act. The legislator makes the law. The executive implements it throughout the regulation, they said. Just because the opponents are particularly shrill in their objection doesn't change the fact that the regulation is no different than hundreds of regulations that the agencies have produced since the New Deal, just as Congress intended them to do, said Richard Rivers, who teaches environmental law at New York University and filled a brief in support of the administration. With the stakes high, each side has drawn legal backing from an array of supporters. Significantly, many of the nation's largest electric utilities, the companies that would be subject to environmental regulations, have filed legal briefs in support of the government. They are joined by 192 members of Congress, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, climate and public health advocates, and tech giants like Apple, Google, and Netflix. Lining up behind the plaintiffs are 91 members of Congress and some of the nation's most powerful conservative groups, including America for Prosperity Foundation, a group affiliated with Libertarian Koch family, and their billions. Mr. Morrissey suggested that he was encouraged by the 6-3 split on the court between conservatives and liberals, including a trio of Trump appointees. We have optimism about the results we're going to get, he said. Biden administration officials and environmentalists concede that given both the composition of the court and its recent decisions against federal rules, such as blocking the mandate and ending Biden's moratorium on evictions, Mr. Morrissey's optimism is probably well-founded. This is certainly a court that is not friendly to government action, said David Dunger, a lawyer for the Natural Resources Defense Council, but there are some reasons why we have a fighting chance. A spokesperson for the Justice Department declined to discuss the case ahead of the oral arguments, but in its brief to the court, the Biden administration urged the court to dismiss the case, noting of the plaintiffs that the current absence of federal greenhouse gas emissions causes them no tangible harm. The argument may resonate with Justice Brett Kavanaugh, one of the conservatives of the court, who first heard the West Virginia case against the Obama's power plant regulation when he was in federal appeals judge in 2015. That appeals court dismissed that case because the rule was only in draft form and not yet final at the time. Mr. Kavanaugh told the West Virginia lawyers, "For us to get in the middle of it before it happens seems highly unusual." The Biden administration will be joined in its oral arguments by some of the nation's largest private and public power companies, which support a broad regulation in the greenhouse pollution. The power companies have said that they prefer the kind of flexibility offered under the Obama plan that would allow them to lower emissions by making changes across the electric grid, shutting down power plants, making others more efficient, and expanding wind and solar. They don't want to be required to make highly prescribed changes to individual power plants, which the plaintiffs argue is the only type of administration can mandate because they say it would drive up cost. The regulated industry itself is saying that they are not fighting the authority of the EPA, said Jody Freeman, a lawyer at Harvard and former client official of the Obama White House. The court will be attentive, I think, to what the industry says, she said, noting that in recent cases over the Biden administration's mandate for large employers, the Supreme Court blocked the mandate except in the case of healthcare workers who requested the regulation. And it was Justice Brett Kavanaugh who made the point, noting in the arguments for the mandate, the people who regulated are not here complaining about the regulation. Lawyers for the EPA will be listening closely because they are expected to propose the power plant climate regulation as soon as next month. The Supreme Court is hearing the case on the same day that scientists convened by the United Nations plan to release a report that is most exhaustive look yet at the dire threats that global warming poses on human civilization, as the impact of climate change are already being felt in the form of devastating floods, wildfires, drought, and rising seas that in the past year alone have killed people and caused billions of dollars in damage across the United States. Mr. Biden has pledged to aggressively cut greenhouse gas. The United States is historically the country that has pumped the most planet-warming pollution into the atmosphere. But Mr. Biden's climate legislation is stalled on Capitol Hill and could collapse if Republicans win control of one or both houses of Congress in the fall's midterm elections. That has placed more emphasis on the power, the authority, and reach of regulations. After it has introduced power plant regulations later this year, the EPA plans to announce tough new limits on auto pollution next year that are intended to speed up the shift from gasoline-powered cars to electric vehicles. And that is why the plaintiffs argue their case is not premature, even though the details of the coming rules are not yet known. The threats are very real, said Mr. Morrissey, the Attorney General of West Virginia. It's imminent right now. Legal experts on both sides said that they see it as the first of many cases that address growing authority on federal agencies at a time when gridlock Congress has failed to pass new laws on issues ranging from climate change to immigration to gun control. Congress gets the fancy pins and nice offices because they're supposed to legislate, but they don't do it, said Mr. Adler, the professor of Case Western Reserve University. There has been a long trend of the executive branch trying to fill the gap between the left and Congress' failure to act, and each administration gets more aggressive on this than the previous one, and there's this larger question of whether the courts should be okay with that. Now, we have a certain part of the population that agrees with this and a certain part of the population that does not agree with this. Looking at it strictly from a financial standpoint, looking at it from a place of, because on this channel I talk about personal finance, business, and money. What we're seeing right now is we're seeing the entire gas and fossil fuel sector pull back, and we're seeing a lot of large corporations across the entire world move into this movement. You're even hearing talks of Steven Schwarzman, founder of Blackstone, and Larry Fink, founder of BlackRock, and all these large companies that are investing all of their capital here, and they're pulling back from the old fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel industry that America was built on and the world was built on. But the big question is, where are things headed? I think where things are going to be headed is going to be rising utility prices and rising gas prices to the point where people are going to beg for a new solution. They're going to beg for an affordable solution. And I think this is going to be presented as that affordable solution, one that's going to be better for the environment. Now, what I think is going to be a very unique shift here is going to be how this impacts real estate, how this impacts one's financial ability to protect and provide for themselves. Because when you change the entire economy, there's going to be some people that are going to make out very well and other people that are simply not. Now, the big question below is, what do you think is going to be the big impact of this change? Do you see this actually taking place, and what do you see being the economic impacts of this? Drop it below, hit that like button, subscribe here, consider subbing on my second channel, my personal channel, and go to TikTok. Follow me on TikTok at This Is John Williams for content I definitely won't post here. So catch you guys later.